All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today with special guest and board member Christine Diindiisi McCleave, who will be talking today about legislative initiatives and consulting with Indigenous peoples. So I met Christine back in 2018 at a psychedelic conference that we were both attending, and our friendship has sort of developed since then and kind of growing and together in the psychedelic space. And had the great honor of having her join the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota Board of Directors, I think around the end of 2022, and just been a very valuable asset to the psychedelic community and helping us get some of these cool legislative initiatives pushed through here in Minnesota, particularly in Minneapolis with the recent executive order by Mayor Frey to deprioritize entheogenic plants and fungi. So about our speaker today, Christine Diindiisi McCleave is an enrolled citizen of the Turtle Mountain Ojibwe Nation, is the past CEO of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, where she worked with the United States Department of the Interior to investigate Indian boarding schools, and she is currently a doctoral student in Indigenous Studies at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Center for Cross-Cultural Studies with a concentration on Indigenous knowledge systems. Her research is focused on Indigenous use of entheogenic plant medicines for healing. With a Bachelor of Science in Communication Studies and a Master of Arts in Leadership, she conducted her master's thesis on Native American spirituality and Christianity and the spectrum of Native spiritual practices today, including peyote religion. As a nonprofit executive, she pioneered an unprecedented national research scope, spoke at the United Nations in New York and Geneva, and helped write a bill for a Truth and Healing Commission in the United States. As an independent consultant, she was part of the Truth and Reconciliation Workshop for the City of Minneapolis, has conducted primary source research for the Alaska Native Heritage Center, and facilitated program development for the Association on American Indian Affairs. She has also worked at the grassroots community level in Denver around the Natural Medicine Health Act and with the decriminalization of entheogens, excluding peyote, in Minneapolis. Currently, she's involved in the federally recognized American Tribes and Indigenous Community Working Group under Colorado's SB 23290 legislation. Overall, her work continues to concentrate on the intersection of cultural, political, and spiritual agency for global Indigenous rights and the healing of historical trauma as a generational survivor of genocidal U.S. Indian boarding schools. In 2023, she was listed as one of the 75 most influential, innovative, and disruptive women in psychedelics by Double Blind Magazine, and she's currently a member of the board for the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota, as well as the Minnesota Council of Churches. So I'll turn it over to Christine, and just want to remind folks that, so this is a webinar, we do have a Q&A function. So if you click down on the bottom of your screen to the Q&A, you will be able to submit questions. And so Christine's going to be presenting for about an hour. And then we'll hold the Q&A till the end, but you're welcome to put your questions into the Q&A during the presentation, and we'll address those questions at the end at about 7 o'clock Central Time. And also there's a chat function if you have specific questions that you'd like to address in the chat. The chat feature is also available. So with that, I'll turn it over to our awesome guest, Christine Diindiisi McCleave, and take it away.
Thank you, Jessica. Miigwech, Buju and Dinaway Magini Duke, Diindiisi Indigenicas, Makinakwa and Dunjaba, Migizi and Dudame. And what I just said to you in Anishinaabe Moan or Ojibwe language is, greetings, my relatives. My name is Diindiisi, that means Blue Jay. And I am Turtle Mountain Ojibwe and I am Eagle Clan. And so this is a traditional protocol Ojibwe greeting. And I am coming to you from my home, which you'll see some cats in the background. And I live in St. Paul, Minnesota, or Minnesota Makoche, which is the Dakota word for our lands here, the land where the water reflects the sky. And originally Turtle Mountain, Turtle Mountain is in North Dakota, but originally my people were, our homelands are here in Minnesota as well, along the northern shore of Lake Superior. And I am the generational survivor of Indian boarding schools. So pictured here is my mother, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather. My grandfather, my great-grandfather went to Indian boarding schools. One of them pictured here, my great-grandfather went to Carlisle, which is pictured here by the Sea of Children. That was the first federal Indian boarding school in the United States. And my mother was placed on adoption with family members. And so this is generational trauma from child removal, from state-sponsored Indian child removal. And so I'll talk a little bit more about, the historical context for this subject today, and not only to tell you who I am and what my background is and where I come from, and who my people are, but also, to help you understand my perspectives and maybe some of the other perspectives of Native American people when it comes to sacred plant medicines and what's happening in this country around that. So as an Indigenous woman who has, as Jessica mentioned to you, worked at Boarding School Healing Coalition and done some work at the United Nations and other work around social justice and racial justice, and my current educational pursuits for my PhD, really just dedicating my professional and personal life to healing for myself primarily, but it ends up being, for my family and for my community, and hopefully for others, for many others, anyone who cares to listen and hear some of my stories and perspectives. So with that, I have a few disclaimers. In this day and age, we have to give some disclaimers. So although I'm on the board of directors for the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota, and this is a webinar hosted by them, I do not speak for the Psychedelic Society or any other non-governmental organizations during this talk today. And although I'm a citizen of the Turtle Mountain Ojibwe Nation, I do not speak for them or any other governmental agencies, including, the state of Colorado. All the views and opinions expressed here today are solely my own. This presenter does not endorse any specific legislation. I'm not lobbying here. I am here to educate and share information. So that's the intentions here for this talk. So I talked a little bit about who I am. I'm going to talk about the historical context of psychedelic legislation and where we find ourselves at this point in history. I'm going to talk about some of the harm potential of the psychedelic boom that's happening, do a legislative assessment and some comparisons for you, and talk about Indigenous communities and tribal nations, and wrap it up with some recommendations. I've worked really hard on this talk for you all, and so I hope that it's not too overwhelming, because there's a lot of information and a lot of ground to cover, and I only have an hour to do it. So I will try not to rush through it, but good thing we're recording so you can listen back later if you want. Because for me, it's really important to share things like context. And so and to explain some of the terminology that I'll be using today. The term Indigenous is a global term. It's contextual. This is a picture of what we refer to as Turtle Island or North America, because it wasn't always North America. The Indigenous peoples who have lived here for thousands of years, back to time immemorial, which is a legal term to say as far as back as anyone can remember, since the beginning of time, this was our homeland, and we were the first peoples here. And we refer to it as Turtle Island. So, the concept of North America is only a couple hundred years old. And it's really important to take that big picture view and get some of that super historical context. You didn't think I was going to go back 10,000 years, did you? So when people say they are Indigenous, it should always be followed up with where they're Indigenous to, because the word means nothing without the context of the land. It's in relationship to the land. And so you'll hear me say Native American as well. It's a little more specific than Indigenous, but it could also apply to people who are Native or Indigenous outside of the United States, like Central America or South America, all the Americas, right? And all those Indigenous peoples on these continents predate any concept of America or any Americas. So that's important to know as well. American Indian is a legal term that even though it's a misnomer, we're never going to get away from that term because it's written into all the legislation in this country. So I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about Indian law and tribal sovereignty. Of course, Ojibwe is even more specific than American Indian, but our word for ourselves is Anishinaabe. So Ojibwe and Anishinaabe, Ojibwe is like the English version of Anishinaabe. So just a little bit of the terminology. You'll probably hear more terminology, and feel free to put things in the Q&A or chat if you have questions. So as I mentioned, Indigenous is contextual. We're talking about place-based cultures and tribal sovereignty. Here in the United States, we had treaties that were made with the government as it was forming to become the United States of America. And interestingly, we weren't considered citizens at first. So when I say I'm a tribal citizen of Turtle Mountain, I'm actually a dual citizen. I'm a citizen of the United States and a citizen of my tribal nation. And the American Indian Citizenship Act is 100 years old this year. It was enacted in 1924. So we've only been citizens for 100 years. We were the last group of people to get citizenship in this country. So we who are Indigenous to the United States, who are citizens of tribal nations, have specific political status as sovereigns. Those nations are sovereign. So when settlers came to this continent and started to form their own nation, they made treaties with those nations that were already here. Why is that important? Because though the psychedelic renaissance may be happening all around the world, the US is still a hegemonic world power. It matters. Here in the United States, tribal nations have political sovereignty. And to understand that political and cultural context for Indigenous peoples is also important. And I just like this graphic because it, kind of throws shade at Britain for trying to colonize the entire world. But honestly, I think, England gets way too much credit for colonization because Russia and China and others have done a lot of colonization, are still doing colonization to this day. So, Britain is just one of the more recent empires to try and expand. And I mean, they had a pretty good attempt here. I don't think anyone else has gotten global empire expansion. Also, there's 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. So that's a lot of different cultures and languages to consider. So a lot of times, when we're talking about tribal nations or Native Americans or Indigenous peoples here in the US, we're talking about a lot of different perspectives. And that doesn't even, mention Canadian First Nations or the Indigenous peoples in Mexico. So I like this quote, and I share this often. We can't start the history of psychedelics in the 60s in the Americas. That needs to stop. We Indigenous people used this medicine before Jesus Christ walked this earth. And that's Lisa Macias Red Bear speaking at a conference called Injustice, Intersectional Trauma, and Psychedelics. And I have it overlaid on a painting called American Progress. And I talk about, and this painting's from 1872. And I talk about this painting a lot because it embodied the idea at the time of manifest destiny. And the idea of manifest destiny was that the settlers that had colonized here on Turtle Island believed it was their God-given right to be here and to dominate this land and the peoples that were here. They felt like it was their right to take over, essentially. And that was really enforced by the doctrine of discovery. And that was a papal bull, a decree by the Pope of the Catholic Church in 1493. That date should sound familiar, right? Because here in the US, we all learn in school about Columbus in 1492. After Columbus got lost in the Caribbean looking for India, the papal bull was the doctrine of discovery said that any Christians who find land that's not being inhabited by Christians already can claim that land for the cross and the crown. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually cited the doctrine of discovery in a US Supreme Court case ruling against a tribal nation for reclaiming their lands. So she used the doctrine of discovery to reinforce that people here in the United States could take the land from Indigenous people who were here before. And historical context matters, especially when we're talking about psychedelics and what's happening around sacred medicines. I think a lot of people are really excited about the potential for healing, the potential to treat mental health and addiction. And maybe, there tends to be a little more focus on the clinical side, but also I think there's a lot of people who are very excited about these medicines as entheogens, as a way to experience the divine and have a spiritual journey. Well, it's important to know, if you're talking about legalizing spiritual sacred medicines in the United States, that this country at one time made it illegal for us Native Americans to practice our spirituality, to practice our ceremonies, to sing and dance and speak our language. The ghost dance movement was a movement to revitalize our culture, to revitalize our ceremonies, to stop the government from stealing our children and taking them to boarding schools. And because it was illegal for them to gather and pray and sing and dance, they had to do the ghost dance at night. And so these were ceremonies done in secret. And it spread from tribe to tribe. And that ghost dance movement was so powerful spiritually, but also so frightening to the federal government that they sent the cavalry, they sent army soldiers to Pine Ridge, and it led to the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. I won't go into other stories about what was going on in the country around this time, but boarding schools had already happened by this time. The country was, killing the buffalo, and I will tell you this, that it's documented that the federal government had a quote unquote Indian problem, and the boarding schools were meant to be a solution to that problem. And their motto was to kill the Indian and save the man. So it essentially amounts to cultural genocide. And why does this matter? Because now people are entering into cultural appropriation around Indigenous ceremonies, or even if they come in a more respectful manner, their fascination with this, sacred part of Indian culture, it lacks an awareness of the fact that at one time in this country, this country tried to abolish our spirituality, right? So I think it's an important part of history that just doesn't get talked about, and it's a big piece of context that's missing from the psychedelic movement happening right now. So a little bit of context there. Many people know, but many people don't know the story of Maria Sabina, and I don't have time to give her story justice right now, but she was a Mazatec curandera who introduced mushrooms to some people, some non-Indigenous people in the 60s. And I don't even want to say his name because, he's becoming famous, and he shouldn't be, because he betrayed Maria, because she said, I will show you the mushrooms and give you a ceremony if you promise not to tell anyone about this. And he promptly went back to the United States and sold the story to Life magazine. And that started the entire 60s psychedelic culture, where John Lennon then went to Maria Sabina's village to do mushrooms. Maria's story is incredibly tragic because her people felt she betrayed them, and they sent her into exile, and she died alone in exile. Um, Also, that the world could be introduced to sacred mushrooms. And I think people don't talk about Maria's story enough, and they don't give that enough consideration and thought and respect. And just there's one example of the impacts of the psychedelic renaissance, right? Also, people are really using the term shaman a lot now, which is kind of interesting because most Native people, in American Indian people, that's not our word. We have each language, each culture has its own word for its people who can do healing or that work with the medicines. I mean, and they might even have multiple roles and multiple words and names depending on what the person's area of knowledge and expertise is. And the fact that a lot of people can now go online and book a retreat, like a vacation, to go and experience sacred medicines in other countries. Or they can book an extended stay. They can go down there for a couple months and learn from quote unquote shamans, and then come back and are, supposedly qualified to be a shaman themselves and to lead ceremonies. It's a cultural phenomenon that needs examining, because some harm is already starting to happen due to these practices. There's growing reports of sexual abuse happening by shamans. And way back in 2018, before Michael Pollan's book and Netflix documentary, there was this show on Vice called Kentucky Ayahuasca, and this white guy from Kentucky, he had a Kentucky accent, was on the show. He was like, I'm a shaman. He went to prison, and he was introduced to ayahuasca by an indigenous man in prison. And then on this show, he basically says he's a shaman and that he has a Native American church. And this is problematic because, and I'll talk about it a little bit more when I talk about the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which gives religious freedom rights to the Native American church, but it's problematic on multiple levels. So recently at the Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver this past summer, a lot of the indigenous peoples from different continents gathered to discuss the impacts of the psychedelic renaissance or psychedelic boom, whichever you want to call it, to indigenous peoples and to the medicines. And they wrote this declaration, which you can find on the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund's website. I have the link here at the bottom for you. And I'm just going to read the highlights. The declaration is quite long, but I just took like the headlines from it, basically. And this is what, and the people who gathered were basically like traditional stewards of the medicine. So, whether you want to call them shamans or medicine people or whatever, these are people in relationship to the medicine whose responsibility it is to care for the medicine. And this is what they had to say. Indigenous methodologies for the safe, responsible, and respectful use of these medicines have existed for millennia. These medicines and protocols are intimately linked to place and language, and extracting them from those contexts has consequences. We must establish pathways to respectful interaction. Rising interest in our medicines globally has unintended consequences that bring harm to our communities. True healing is a multifaceted process and not a destination or a quick fix. Traditional medicine communities are in their own processes of healing using their own methods. First, these processes must be supported, not interrupted, before the psychedelic boom asks for or takes more. Indigenous knowledge holders must be included in the debate and conversation. We have a responsibility as human citizens to do no harm through our endeavors. We insist on free, prior, and informed consent as it pertains to the use of these medicines. You can reference the United Nations Rights of Indigenous Peoples and biodiversity protocols. Consent and consultation is a complex and multifaceted process, and in most cases concerning our medicines, consent has not truly been given. The ways in which medicines are harvested have impacts, and ecological and ethical practices must be used. Conservation, reparation, restorative justice, and acknowledgement must be built in. Appropriation is a real concern, and there are ways to appreciate our medicines and cultures without appropriating. It is important to exercise reflection on our areas of privilege when interacting with Indigenous communities in a Western and capitalistic exchange and framework. We exist for future generations, and conservation is best directed by Indigenous peoples. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk about some legislation, and we'll circle back to that. Like I said, I have a lot to share with you tonight. Take a deep breath. Get yourself some water and take good care of yourself, because this is, you might have thought you were going to come just to talk about legislation, but surprise, I don't roll like that. I have like deep things to say to you. So when first of all, let's set a little, context here. When we're talking about legislation, that can look like legalization, legal frameworks that actually set up a way for the medicine to be sold, to be delivered to people in a legal framework, or decriminalization, which has its complications as well, because these medicines, a lot of them are still illegal at the federal level. So even if a city or a state, quote unquote, decriminalizes, they're really just saying that it's a lower priority for law enforcement. But the feds and the DEA can always exert their right to enforce the law at the federal level. So under legalization, like I said, it's a framework for delivering the medicines to people. So that's usually in a clinical and therapeutic setting. It does make these medicines commodities, which then have to be regulated. There's often certification and licensing that gets involved around who gets to manufacture, distribute, and by manufacture, I mean cultivate, right? But they could be, in some cases, synthetic, so it could be manufacturing, but manufacture, cultivate, distribute, transport, and sell products and commodities related to the medicines. And usually there's some kind of provision in there about criminal records being expunged, right? Like, oops, our bad, this was illegal, now it's legal. And then under decriminalization, this is usually directed at, community use, spiritual use, religious use. It's not just the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, but, we've got other churches like the Santo Daime Church that have religious freedom rights in play here in the United States. And this typically is about, grow, gift, gather, so you can forage nature without, being like, wow, God grew this medicine for me, but I can't take it because it's illegal. Or you can gift things to people, but the minute money exchanges hands, then, we're talking about the other model, right? So decriminalization is usually not set up for people to establish a business around the medicines. And of course, with a lot of these, like I mentioned, community, spiritual, and religious frameworks that are being borrowed from Indigenous people around the world, these kind of like new age ways of being spiritual involve a lot of cultural appropriation. So what's going on in the United States right now? Oh my gosh, a lot. This is why I think it's a psychedelic boom, and agree with some of those traditional medicine people who wrote that declaration and called it the boom. Um, I think, we're seeing a couple of things happen here. One, I think there's just a lot of suffering people that really want help and see this as a solution. I think the legalization of cannabis in half of the United States has really paved the way for psychedelic legislation to follow. But I think because of that, people are not being as careful. It's not taking as long for this to happen. It's going faster. And the word boom implies that the growth is rapid and that it's chaotic. It could harm, right? So there's a lot to consider. But I found this map on Psychedelic Alpha's website, and as you can see, there are only 2 states that have legalization and regulations in statute. Okay, so that's Oregon and Colorado have passed legislation, but a lot of other states are doing various other things, right? Like they've either introduced legislation that's waiting to be passed, or that didn't pass and they're going to introduce it again. Well, that the map also shows some inactive or failed legislation. It says active for California, so I think the map is not updated because that one did not go through. But it also interestingly lists little cities that have done decriminalization, right? And that's kind of where we saw it happening first before the pandemic out in Oakland, California. But this map also notes limited judicial exceptions and reduced penalty statutes. So I think this map is very thorough, as well as funding and research, right? So very thorough and really interesting to see all the different ways that people are approaching this. And then to narrow it down, because that's a lot to analyze, I narrowed it down to 8 states, which is still kind of a lot. You'll see I'll keep narrowing it down here. But we're going to look at these states here. All right. So Oregon, Texas, Colorado, Minnesota, California, Kentucky, Washington, and Massachusetts. I know you guys are excited because this is what you came for, right? This is where I started. I was like, okay, this is what I have to deliver. And then I was like, oh, but I have to give context. I just can't just drop this on you without some context and some follow-up, right? So we're about in the middle here. So I'm doing good on time. And I went in chronological order. Oregon in November of 2020 passed a ballot measure, Prop 109, the Psilocybin Services Act. Okay, so it's just psilocybin products. It was implemented. It took them a few years to write their regulations, and there was a pandemic in there and all that. So it just got implemented last summer. So this model is up and running. A lot of people say, go Oregon, right? Well, yeah, they're blazing the trail for the rest of the country. I couldn't resist for any other Gen Xers out there. They're not an easy position to be in, to be the first, right? We'll talk a little bit more about some of the criticisms of their legislation and their model that they have. Texas, this surprised me when I put it in chronological order. Who thought Texas was going to be, paving the way there? But in June of 2021, they had a House Bill 1801, which set a clinical study in motion for psilocybin treatment of PTSD in veterans. The report for their clinical study is due December 1st, later this year, 2024. Colorado in November of 2022 passed a ballot measure, Prop 122, but that was followed up by a Senate Bill 23290, which replaced Prop 122. But originally, it was a ballot measure. This is for the Natural Medicine Health Act, and it includes psilocybin and psilocin until June 2026, at which time they will have assessed further natural medicines of DMT, iboga, and mescaline. This is scheduled for implementation starting January of 2025. So they have the rest of this year to finish writing their regulations and getting input from tribal communities and Indigenous peoples, which I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide, or a couple slides later. Minnesota, yes, most of us are on this, even though we made this national, most of us are probably from Minnesota. And in March of 2023, there was an omnibus bill in which was written into, this large bill with many provisions, a psychedelic medicine task force, which it was to look at MDMA, psilocybin, and LSD. That final report is from the task force is due January 1st, 2025. California in September last year of 23 passed Senate Bill 58. It didn't even get a name. That's why that next one is blank. But it was talking about psilocybin and psilocin, as well as DMT, mescaline, excluding peyote. However, it was vetoed by the governor in October. So that was disappointing for a lot of people in California. Kentucky, I was shocked at the southern states here. So this really says a lot about the landscape in psychedelics in the country. Kentucky in December of 2023 had an opioid abatement advisory commission vote on a clinical study to do ibogaine research for drug addiction. It was voted down, but there was a very large discussion with many millions of dollars on the table. And so they decided not to go forward with it, but it made the news. The state of Washington in January, like first week of January this year, introduced Senate Bill 5977. Now, this is not the first bill that Washington has done, but it's the current one. It doesn't have a name yet, but it is for psilocybin and psilocybin mushrooms for nonprofits. It is still in committee. Massachusetts has garnered enough public signatures via petition to get a ballot measure going for November of this year in 2024 around regulated access to psychedelic substances. And it will likely include psilocybin because that's the front runner here, as we can see, and who knows what else, but it's still being written. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically now, going to narrow it down, about Oregon, Colorado, Washington, and Massachusetts. Okay, so in Oregon, the Psilocybin Services Act, quote unquote, directs the Oregon Health Authority to license and regulate the manufacturing, transportation, delivery, sale, and purchase of psilocybin products and the provision of psilocybin services. There are 4 types of licenses: manufacturing, laboratory, service centers, and facilitators. The service centers began to open their doors to clients this past summer, end quote. So the criticisms that I've heard are that the program is very cost prohibitive. It's very expensive. And that is because these are cash programs, basically where the state has to charge licensing fees in order to pay the staff to track everything, to run the program at the government level, right? And so it's expensive in the beginning, and hopefully, eventually enough licenses are sold that there can be enough revenue to perhaps make the program a little more affordable, but who knows, right? These are the challenges of governance. And so right now what's happening is the philanthropic sector is at work to address these socioeconomic disparities in access. And from what I can tell, tribal engagement is not evident. There's nothing written about it in the act, nothing being written about it in the news articles that I perused. and nothing coming to me on the wind from tribal relatives that I know who live in Oregon from tribal nations there. The Colorado Natural Medicine Health Act, as I mentioned, this one was originally a ballot measure that got replaced by a Senate bill. And the main difference with the Senate bill was the inclusion of the federally recognized American Tribes and Indigenous Community Working Group. It's a long title, that's the official title. So I'm going to shorten that to Tribal Working Group, because what happened was the Prop 122 established a natural medicine advisory committee to inform the state on, how to set up these regulations. And one of the subcommittees on the advisory council was an Indigenous subcommittee. However, all the people who got appointed to the advisory council and, some of the people who ended up on the Indigenous subcommittee, none of them, not one, was a tribal citizen. Some of them were Indigenous, and not even all of them were Indigenous on the Indigenous subcommittee, but some of them were Indigenous to places outside the United States, right? So back to that, one of those early slides, Indigenous is contextual, all right? So that was a huge misstep, and they heard about it from tribal citizens in Colorado who said, we are not being represented. This could infringe upon our religious rights and our tribal sovereignty. You need to consult with tribal nations. You need to consult with tribal citizens. And so this working group was established and will be specifically addressing these 4 points precisely. A, avoiding the misappropriation and exploitation of the federally recognized American tribes and Indigenous people, communities, cultures, and religion. B, avoiding the excess commercialization of natural medicine product, and natural medicine services. C, any conservation issues associated with the legislation and regulation of natural medicine or natural medicine product, including the potential for further depletion of peyote due to peyote being a source of mescaline. And D, best practices and open communication to build trust and understanding between the federally recognized American tribes and Indigenous people and communities, the board, the division, the state licensing authority, and law enforcement agencies for the purpose of avoiding unnecessary burdens and criminalization of traditional tribal and Indigenous uses of natural medicine. It's filled with some legalese, but essentially they're talking about addressing cultural appropriation, commercialization, conservation, and best practices. I have been contracted with Project Mosaic, a Denver-based Native-owned consulting firm, to work with the state of Colorado to facilitate this working group, being that I'm a tribal citizen and doing my dissertation in this field. So the application is currently open for tribal citizens and Indigenous peoples to apply to the working group. And I'm really excited to see the work that's going to come out of this working group this year. And that will likely be looked upon by not just Colorado, but the rest of the world, right? That they're setting a precedent here. And I'm really glad to be a part of it. So Washington is interesting because I didn't know that there was already a bill introduced in the spring of 2023, but it didn't get past the Senate in that state. The current bill is another attempt at psychedelic legislation, and it's got interesting language. It says, it starts out with, it's not a violation of this chapter or another state or local law for a nonprofit organization to purchase, receive, possess, cultivate, deliver, or dispose of psilocybin or psilocybin mushrooms, or for a participant to possess or consume psilocybin in accordance with this section. The nonprofit organization under subsection 1 of this section must A, have an explicit goal of promoting wellness for and assisting military veterans or first responders, including without limitation, law enforcement, firefighters, coroners, and medical examiners and emergency medical personnel. B, facilitate psilocybin services using the set and setting method of experiencing psilocybin substances. That's really interesting, huh? C, use facilitators licensed by the state of Oregon and others, or another state with a state facilitator license and licensure requirements. Okay, need a sip here. That's a mouthful. Okay. So I find it really interesting. They have gone really narrow with this. So only psilocybin, only nonprofits, and specifically, saying that you have to use the set and setting method. So, they're not making room for spiritual and community use to be defined by community members. What's interesting here is I don't see tribal engagement happening either. I did serve on a panel with Senator Solomon, who helped introduce this bill when I was at the Horizons Conference in Portland, Oregon in December of 2023. And I followed up with him after, discussing the need for tribal engagement, and I introduced him to the executive director for the Urban Indian Health Institute in Seattle, Washington, as well as a former tribal chairperson of the Tulalip tribes in Washington. And it didn't really go anywhere, sadly. And, this is all public discourse, so it's on the public record. So I'm just going to share what his response was. And this is, meant to be to take the conversation further, not to throw shade at all. And he says, I'm not aware of any traditional use of this mushroom among local Washington state-based tribes. I certainly could be wrong about this. I have discussed the policy with some local tribes and have received some interest from the perspectives of them wanting to look at bringing this into tribal treatment facility, but I have received no feedback about traditional use beyond that context. I recognize that tribal members may not want to share information on certain religious practices, given the history of U.S. government policy and more modern cultural appropriation issues. I did make sure there were 2 seats for Indigenous practitioners, tribal representatives on the task force that has now finalized its work. To my knowledge, nobody joined these slots. Okay, so that's interesting that his response kind of shrugs it off as, psilocybin mushrooms aren't the traditional medicine of tribes in Washington. Well, that doesn't mean that these sovereign nations within that state shouldn't be consulted. And I also find it interesting to note that, they had room for tribal representatives on their task force, but they didn't have tribal representatives on their task force. I don't know the story of what happened there, but hello, Minnesota, does this sound familiar? So we could probably do a whole other webinar on why tribes aren't engaging, but I don't have time for that. Let's go on to Massachusetts. There were these petition signatures, like numbering almost 100,000, so that they could have a ballot measure this year. However, there are 2 groups fighting about what to put on the ballot, what the bill should look like. So there's a New Approach PAC, a political action committee, and the Bay Staters for Natural Medicine, which is a grassroots community group. I find it interesting that the Bay Staters for Natural Medicine, the Bay Staters website, I've been following them on social media for a few years, and I like some of the things that they're doing. They were ahead of everyone in the decriminalized nature movement in terms of immediately stepping up to the plate and saying mescaline excluding peyote, right? And I was like applauding them because the fact that we even had to argue for people to exclude peyote is an issue unto itself. So their website specifically identifies psilocybin mushrooms, cacti containing mescaline, ayahuasca, and ibogaine. And I'm not even going to read what they say about psilocybin because it's just a bunch of cheerleading for psilocybin. But what they say about cacti with mescaline is, quote, many forms of cacti contain mescaline, which can catalyze spiritual experiences and addiction recovery for many people. San Pedro cacti are the most abundant source of mescaline. Base daters discourages non-Indigenous people from purchasing and consuming peyote because this species of cacti is at risk of extinction across the Southwest due to poaching by collectors, as well as the meat, gas, and mining industries. This is true. Prohibition destroys the transparency necessary to hold poachers accountable and inhibits experts' sustainably grafting peyote onto San Pedro to replenish it in the wild. We discourage the media from mentioning peyote and ibogaine without detailed explanation of its sustainability challenges in our effort to be part of the solution in sustaining these species. I think they're trying to do a good job here. There's room for improvement. Okay. What they're saying about San Pedro being the most abundant source of mescaline is problematic because nothing is unlimited in this finite world. Everything on this planet and in our known universe needs to be considered with a sustainability mindset. Okay. I was just told today by somebody in relationship to the medicine that San Pedro is called Wachuma by the Peruvian indigenous people, and there are issues with conservation and sustainability. So what they're saying here about grafting peyote onto San Pedro is frankly sacrilegious to those who are in relationship with these two sacred medicines. Ayahuasca, this brew, they say, quote, this brew is made from the leaves of shrubs and the stalks of vines native to the Americas. It's traditionally prepared by a Curandano healer. This plant medicine, referred to as Mother Aya, catalyzes significant spiritual experiences that many describe as life-changing encounters with the divine. Decriminalization is a necessary step to ensure U.S. ceremonies are done in a safe, accountable way that protects this plant species and honors the indigenous ancestral practices. DMT, the active ingredient, can also be made with many of the same spiritual benefits without threatening sustainability of this incredible wild plant species or the Sonoran desert toads poached for 5-MeO DMT. Again, I think they are trying to do a good job here. They talk about honoring indigenous peoples and ancestral practices, but what they don't know what they don't know. What they don't know that I know is that synthetic versions of these sacred medicines is controversial. And I don't have time to go into all the details. I'm just trying to, go a mile wide and inch deep for you so you can get an idea of all the issues at play here. And then lastly, ibogaine, they say a shrub native to the jungle region of Gabon, Cameroon, Angola, and the Congo in Africa. Iboga root bark ibogaine can be used to catalyze profound spiritual experiences and relieve symptoms of withdrawal for opioid and alcohol addiction in profound ways. Decriminalization and legalization are necessary steps to bring transparency to supply chains to prevent poaching. We advise that ibogaine be used by people who are well positioned in their lives to move past it. Again, I'm just going to stop. I just listened in on a call with some folks from Gabon last week, and guess what? You already know. Yes, the indigenous peoples are having issues with access and sustainability of their sacred medicine because a global demand has been created for their traditional medicine. So we have a lot of work to do, people, okay? In this country, when it comes to tribal consultation, there's a lot to know about Indian laws, and I see I'm kind of running low on time here. I just want to point out that The Declaration of Independence calls us merciless Indian savages, and that there were laws in this country called the Dead Indian Act, the Indian Removal Act, the Indian Civilization Act. Okay, so historical context, right? More recently, we do have some acts that talk about our rights. We moved into the self-determination era in the 70s, thanks to the civil rights movement and the American Indian movement. We gained control over our education after the, genocide of the Indian boarding schools. And we have American Indian religious freedom. We needed a specific law to protect our religious freedom because our religious practices were made illegal. Okay, so this is a legislative timeline I put together when I worked at the Boarding School Healing Coalition. If you want to learn more and look at it, you can go to boardingschoolhealing.org. All right, I'm going to skip that and just move right into recommendations because I have quite a few for you. Okay, so when it comes to harm reduction, people talk about that in terms of like how to help, how to make sure the drugs don't harm you. And I'm talking about like, let's just not harm human beings and the planet, like not even with drugs, but like with our legislation, with our research, with our fascination, with our seeking, with our pleading for an end to our suffering. Like let's take things to the next level in terms of how we go about this. We need to consider sustainability, shared benefits, and rightful relationships, not only with each other, but with the medicines. We need to prioritize, not appropriate, Indigenous knowledge, consult with Indigenous communities and specifically tribal nations, and practice the 6 R's of Indigenous research, yes, in legislation as well as community interactions: respect, relationship, relevance, reciprocity, responsibility, and representation. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples can be implemented in this case. Specifically, Article 24 talks about Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional medicines and to maintain their health practices, including the conservation of their vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. Indigenous individuals also have the right to access, without any discrimination, to all social and health services. Indigenous individuals have an equal right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. States shall take the necessary steps with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of this right. And then I've been saying this, I'll eventually make a meme, I guess, so that I can share it on social media, but this quote I keep changing. And today I tweaked it to say people planning to do anything. I used to say research, and then I was like legislation. And then I was just like anything. People planning to do anything with natural medicines should consider the impact on the ecosystems and the Indigenous peoples who rely on them. The Article 31 of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples says we have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestation of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of the properties of fauna and flora, oral traditions, literatures, designs, sports, and traditional games, and visual and performing arts. They also have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. Notably, 144 countries signed on and adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples when it was introduced in 2007, with 11 abstentions and 4 countries voting against it. Those 4 countries were Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia, the 4 countries who had national policies to remove Indigenous children and send them to residential boarding schools for cultural assimilation. Those countries have since endorsed the declaration, but none have implemented it. The declaration remains the gold standard on the rights of Indigenous peoples globally. So I'm almost done. I think is that more for me or for you? We're in the home stretch here. Okay, so intellectual property rights and the rights of nature. Okay, in attempting to understand how we can protect Indigenous rights, one framework is cultural and intellectual property rights, which the Declaration itself, mentioned. However, one must first declare that the Indigenous view on plant medicines is as plant relatives, living beings with autonomous spirits that cannot be owned. It's contrary to the entire concept of Western property law. Nature cannot be owned. Cultural and intellectual property rights specifically tries to be inclusive of a diverse cultures, but it's still based on a colonial capitalist legalist construct with the idea of property and ownership of natural resources. People who have passed the rights of nature into law. Oh yeah, most cultural and intellectual property laws aren't meant to protect the plants. They're meant to protect the human rights to profit from plants. So that's a major paradigm shift that we need to get a handle on, especially as we continue to write legislation across the country. However, Indigenous peoples have found a way to make the law work for our worldview. In 2008, Ecuador and Bolivia both added the rights of nature clauses to their constitutions. In 2010, Bolivia adopted the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth. 2016, the Ho-Chunk Nation in Wisconsin became the first U.S. tribe to adopt the rights of nature. In 2017, the Ponca Nation in Oklahoma became the second U.S. tribe to adopt the rights of nature. In 2017, the New Zealand government granted the Wangani River the full legal rights of a person as part of its settlement with the Wanguni Iwi, a Maori people. That's the third largest river in Aotearoa. That's New Zealand. India granted full legal rights to the Ganges and Yamuna rivers, and the Himalayan glaciers are also recognized as having the rights to exist. The medicines have their own autonomy and spirits. Nature has a conscious spirit. They all have the right to exist and be protected. When it comes to ethical research and legislation, it should not just conform to the highest ethical standards, but to Indigenous standards. Wow, meditate on that for a while, huh? Avoiding academic imperialism or academic colonization, which I defined in a 2021 paper as quoted here. Consulting with Indigenous communities, obtaining free, prior, and informed consent, respecting cultural intellectual property rights and the rights of nature, and decolonizing data. Public health considerations, right? Because even if like in Washington, like, okay, these aren't their traditional medicines, well, the urban, as we've seen here, the decolonizing data was written by the Urban Indian Health Institute in Seattle. So when it comes to tribal people, we live in urban settings too, as was defined by the Indian Relocation Act of the 1950s. Like literally they relocated. First they said we couldn't leave the reservation. It was illegal for us to leave the reservation. And then they said, no, you need to leave the reservation and go to the city. So anyways, we live in the cities too. We're dealing with historical trauma from all those terrible genocidal policies. We even have a measurement to measure our historical loss and how often we think about loss to our culture, land, and people as a result of European colonization. I can tell you, if you look this study up, it's a lot of people think about it daily. And cultural revitalization has been shown to be healing for us. In a qualitative study, American Indian elders discussed that healing from intergenerational historical trauma involves tribal culture, reclamation, including speaking one's native language, and spirituality. Traditional healing ceremonies promote wellness by reflecting native concepts of spirit, creator, and the universe. So this goes back to that declaration by the medicine conservation people, saying like native people are in their own process of healing, and that needs to happen before more can be asked of them and taken from them, right? So when it comes to legislating medicines, you need to consider, the public health from an Indigenous perspective. What about Native Americans? Do we want to go interact with psilocybin therapy the same way, or should it be culturally relevant? I mean, there's a cluster for you. I don't have the answer to that one. Connection to the land is healing, right? Walking in beauty, a Native woman's ideal state of well-being and health requires a close connection to the earth and living in harmony with the environment. A recent study of Dene youth caregivers and elders revealed connections to the land were a vital cultural strength on which to build efforts to promote mental health, well-being, and healing. We have Indigenous protocols for researching with Indigenous peoples at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The University of Arizona Native Nations Institute has resources on tribal data sovereignty. So if you're going to do research with tribal nations, and the Nagoya Protocol was adopted in October 2010 in Nagoya, Japan, during the 10th meeting of parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. It emphasizes sustainability, shared benefit, and rightful relationships. I won't read it here. Well, I only have a couple slides left, and we still have some time for questions. So this one's important because it talks about the Nagoya Protocol on biological diversity is a supplementary agreement to the convention. It provides a transparent legal framework for the effective implementation of one of the three objectives: the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. Benefit sharing obligations are domestic level benefit sharing measures to provide for the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources, with the contracting party providing genetic resources. Utilization includes research and development on the genetic or biochemical composition, as well as subsequent applications and commercialization. Sharing is subject to mutually agreed terms. Benefits may be monetary or non-monetary, such as royalties and the sharing of research results. So basically, when you're talking about profiting off of someone else's biodiversity, you should include them in your development, and if they agree, your profits, right? The Nagoya Protocol addresses traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources with provisions on access, benefit sharing, and compliance. It also addresses genetic resources where Indigenous and local communities have the established right to grant access to them. Contracting parties are to take measures to ensure these communities' prior informed consent and fair and equitable benefit sharing, keeping in mind community laws and procedures, as well as customary use and exchange. We need, I think, to address this. I don't know who. I was just going to say who, but I don't know who. We need some kind of, we've got task forces happening, we've got advisory councils happening. Somehow, some way, as a society, we need to address the fact that this country, the United States, whose only medicine that's indigenous to its colonial borders is peyote, okay, is about to appropriate and commodify medicines from around the world. Indigenous epistemologies can be very different from Western ways of knowing. Conservation needs to be considered for peyote because its conservation status is vulnerable at the international level, or I'm sorry, in the US, and endangered at the international level. Ayahuasca has a global demand driving deforestation in the Amazon. Iboga is seriously endangered, according to the US report from 2000, the year 2000, 24 years ago. Nobody else has found this. I forgot to cite my source. Sorry, I'll look that up. Oh, I have it here. USA.gov. I do have a source. And Bufo alvarius toad is endangered in California and threatened in New Mexico. All these natural medicines are tied to ceremonial cultures of Indigenous people who've been in harmonious relationship with the medicine for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And we've seen what can happen in a very short amount of time. So we need to pump the brakes slow things down a little bit. I know a lot of people won't want to hear that, but honestly, we owe it to ourselves. We owe it to our children and our grandchildren who will be impacted by these laws that we're putting in place. And like I said, we don't know what we don't know. We have no idea how this is going to affect future generations. We aren't considering how this is going to affect the medicine and the planet. So, gosh, I really should have had a little more uplifting ending for you all, but Miigwech, thank you so much for listening, for staying with me and really, opening your minds and opening your hearts to hear what I had to say. I know it is not, it's not easy. It's not an easy message for me to deliver. I'm sure it's not easy to hear. It's a great weight of responsibility that we have. All of us who are here today are here because we care about the medicine and people's access to this medicine. And I really pray and hope that we can do a good job for ourselves and for future generations. So with that, here's my contact info, and I'm gonna open it up for Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christine. So I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A. So if folks want to go ahead and put any questions you have for Christine in the Q&A, and then while you do that, I guess I'll just ask a few questions of things that you kind of were mentioning, putting a pin in. And so being able to let you expand on that a little bit more in the like 20 minutes or so that we have left. So why do you think that the tribes aren't engaging with these state task forces?
I mean, that's a big question. And I think top of the list is probably because we have enough to deal with already. And by we, I mean tribal leaders. so I don't know if it was clear if people glean this from the presentation, but there's, on one hand, you can engage with quote unquote indigenous communities, which, as I mentioned, can include indigenous peoples from outside the United States, but they live here now, but also includes tribal citizens. And then on the other hand, you have an official government to government process with sovereign tribal nations, whether it's state government or federal government or municipal government, it can still be government to government. And when it comes to tribal government, these are elected leaders. Well, the legislative timeline that I showed you guys, I was running low on time, but there was one called the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934 that basically said if tribes didn't adopt a US-like constitution, that they would be terminated, meaning the US government would not recognize them as sovereign nations anymore. So that's where the term federally recognized tribes come into play, because some tribes are no longer federally recognized. That's a whole nother thing. But these elected leaders under these tribal governments are running little nations. I mean, these people are dealing with, the infrastructure of their communities. They're dealing with all the issues around education and access to healthcare. They're engaging with the federal government, and they have their hands full. And frankly, I've done a lot of work with the National Congress of American Indians, in which a lot of those tribal leaders, tribal council people, tribal chairs will go to the National Congress. And I've done a lot of education, and the Native Governance Center, which is here in Minnesota, also has a program called Nation Builders, and where they try to educate tribal leaders. But just thinking about, all the things that you need to know to be a tribal leader and all the things that you're responsible for, it can be overwhelming. And then we're talking about, you know, the historical context and all the issues that our communities face because of colonization, because of everything that's happened, and that arc of terrible Indian legislation that, you know, has taken a good turn in the last couple of decades. But, you know, you don't fix that stuff overnight. It takes a couple centuries to undo the damage of centuries long genocide campaign. So I honestly think tribal leaders, you know, in general, might not be completely educated on the issue, and also may just be like, you know, not having the bandwidth, or, you know, not seeing the relevance, right? If you've got 10 fires to put out and, you know, somebody's buzzing in your ear about mushrooms, you're like, whatever. And a lot of tribal people, a lot of native people don't talk about psychedelics. We don't even use that word. That's not our word, right? So, you know, they recognize peyote as a medicine, but even then, not all the 570 some tribes in this country have a relationship with peyote either. And then within a tribe that might have a relationship with peyote, might have a Native American church, even fewer of those citizens are actually, you know, members of the church and actively engaged. And so it just, in terms of, those are some of the issues I see with why we're not getting tribal engagement, and on a broad level, right? And as well as maybe, as we saw from, you know, Senator Solomon's response in Washington, leaders and legislators not maybe knowing exactly how to engage them. Like I said, you can engage with a community, an urban population, or you can engage with a tribal government. And those are two very different processes. Okay, so I do see a question here.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. It sounds like a very complicated process of asking a lot of people. So do you want me to read this question out loud, or do you want to?
I don't know how to answer that question. You can read it and I'll respond.
So the question, just for the recording, is, can you expand on Maria Sabina? I heard the story that she was not taught how to work with the medicine by her people, but reported that she ate the mushrooms as a hungry child, and the medicine itself taught her how to administer it. Is that story apocryphal? Forgive my editorings, forgive me not knowing that apocryphal word, but yeah, do you have any comments or thoughts about that?
Yeah, can we Google that word? What does that word mean? So yeah, I really want to know what that word means. Is that
A story or a statement of doubtful authenticity.
Oh, okay. So is that story authentic? Gee, I don't know. You know, some people think I know a lot of things, and sometimes I think I know a lot of things. But the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know a lot. This journey to get a PhD has been exactly like that, where the more I learn, the more I'm like, holy moly, there's so much I don't know. You know, that certain amount of humility that comes with being a human being in right relationship, right? And so I am not an expert on Maria Sabina. I know you can read books about her, and some of those books, well, probably a lot of them, have been written by non-Indigenous people. And you know, on the other hand, it's not appropriate or respectful to go down to her village and harass her people wanting to know stories about her, right? Like, I think we've done enough damage to that village and those people. So I'm sorry, I can't answer your question.
Thank you for trying. I think I'm going to put in the chat, there's just a lovely article from Chacruna, just kind of about the history, at least of how kind of the story you were telling, Christine, about kind of the life article and how that came to be and what led to that. So that might help bring some context there for those that are interested. It looks like we have another question, and I also had this question as well. What about synthetic psychedelics like LSD and MDMA that are not plant medicines or have a history of use by Indigenous people? Do those fall outside the issues that you present?
I like this question too. This is a very good question. Thank you for asking. Um, Again, in all respect and humility, I don't think that I have all the answers. And part of my PhD journey is so that I can learn more. And so this is, something that I think we should all be exploring. But that being said, my gut response is that, you're onto something here, because taking a synthetic of a plant that has a spirit is like is like cloning a human being, right? Like, what are the spiritual implications of that? We clone plants apparently, right? Like, if you have a cannabis plant, you can clone it and have two. And what does that do to the spirit of the plant? What does that do to the molecules of the plant? Apparently it doesn't affect the potency or the molecular structure, right? Like, the plant remains the same. It's identical, supposedly, right? But that's just one way of looking at it. So separating molecules from a plant that has a spirit, like some of these medicines, right? And these spirits are different, like the spirit of tobacco, right? The spirit of cannabis has a spirit too. And I don't know everything, so hopefully I'm not saying really stupid stuff that's going to haunt me on the internet someday. but from what I can glean, the spirits of some of these plants that we're talking about are really powerful. So I think something is happening with cannabis as we continue to genetically modify it. We haven't done enough studies, like people are starting to have some issues. And, we saw that tobacco, once it got commodified and, modified, started to cause people issues with cancer, and same for opioids. So when we take these medicines and we mess with them, something's happening. We don't know what we're messing with. We don't know what's happening on a spiritual level. And so yes, big caution when it comes to that. But good question. What about a molecule that we invent? If you want to go, now I'm just like, pontificating here, like completely getting way out there. But like, if you want to take things like on a quantum level, right? Like, we didn't pull those things out of thin air. They existed, right? Like, chemists take things and put them together to create something new. So it already exists. So what are we pulling together to make LSD and to make MDMA would be my question. And what elements are we using, and what are the spiritual components that we're putting together? Because I would say even those synthetic medicines have a spirit, even if it's a synthetic spirit, if that makes sense. I hope that doesn't sound too crazy. And, I could have just ended it with, I don't know.
No, I think you did a good job. That was a good kind of pontification of how you feel about that. So there was another question. It's more of a wanting to see the slide again of the history of the terrible US laws against tribal people. They said that was very painful to see. Could you put it back up, and would it be all right to take a photo of it to be able to share it with our local Beyond the Land acknowledgement groups? It's important for white people to know these things.
Yeah, I have better for you than taking a picture of it. I will put a link in the chat for, where is it? It's on the boarding school healing website, and it's a whole educational primer. So I just dropped the link in the chat. This is on their website. It's a PDF of this 16-page educational primer that I helped put together when I was there, talking about boarding schools, and it's the centerfold. That timeline is the centerfold right in the middle there. So if you scroll down to, I don't know, page 5 and 6 or whatever pages it's on, and then you can share that PDF or however you want to share it. That they have a lot of educational resources on that website too.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. All right, we got one more question and about 5 minutes left. So what have you found helps to bridge understanding and empathy in cross-cultural or cross-ontological dialogues between Indigenous or Native concerns and the West and the issues Native people raise about ongoing coloniality, extractivism, commercialization, etc., as it relates to psychedelics?
It's a big question. Well, there's kind of two parts, right? So what helps bridge the understanding and empathy in these cross-cultural dialogues between Indigenous, and Indigenous in the West, that's part one. And then the issues that Native people raise about ongoing coloniality as it relates to psychedelics. This is a two-part question. What helps to bridge understanding, I think, is education. I'm a big believer in education, which is kind of ironic because this country had this policy to use education as a weapon to destroy our cultures. Yet here I am as an Indigenous woman pursuing the highest education. I'm like, I went and got a bachelor's, went and got a master's. I'm like, I need a PhD too. So there is something for me about the pursuit of knowledge. Like I said, I don't know a lot and I want to know more. And I feel it's our responsibility to know more. And I wish that a lot of our oral history and ancient knowledge that was passed down for generations could have been more preserved, and that I would have had that in my family. But I think what helps people build those bridges is to have these discussions and to learn from one another. And so when I say education, I don't necessarily mean in a colonial sense, because not everything comes from academia, right? Not everything that is known has to be gazed upon by the Western world. There is so much that is known by Indigenous peoples, knowledge that, like I said, was passed down orally and protected, knowledge that was valuable enough to be told over and over again. Like, can you imagine how that worked? Like, and I think, this idea that Western people came to this country and looked down upon that, like, oh, they don't write, they don't have a written language, they just have oral tradition. And instead of marveling at it and being like, wow, they committed everything to memory, and everything that was important got passed down and retold over and over again. So I think just pausing to make those knowledge inquiries and to think about how knowledge is gained and how it's treated and where it comes from, all of that can help with our understanding. And that it's a big question that was asked there. Like I said, it's two parts. So the concerns, I think, if I have this totally anecdotal theory about the pendulum. I've noticed this pendulum vibe in my life since my 20s. And my theory goes that this pendulum swings back and forth to extremes. And constantly looking for balance. When it's too far this way, it has to swing way over here in order to, for a moment, get balance in the middle, right? But it's constantly moving, swinging back and forth, trying to balance itself out. And what I think has happened, where we can see this pendulum theory at work in many aspects of our society right now, right? The pendulum has swung a little too far in the direction of elite wealth. That's going to have to swing back in this direction. It can only go so far before physics take over. And in terms of Western and Indigenous paradigms, worldviews, ontologies, cosmologies, the pendulum has definitely been over here on the Western side. It's been dominant, right? And so I think a truly Indigenous worldview would be like, it needs to come into balance and it needs to be in harmony. But I walk in two worlds, right? And my colonial side says, no, actually, it needs to swing over here in order to find balance. We need to let Indigenous worldview be dominant. And actually, I think we're going to need it to save this planet. And the way humanity is going, in this direction, it's not sustainable. And so that's what I honestly think needs to happen. And, a lot of people talk about inviting Indigenous people to the table. And every once in a while, you'll have a really, wise Ogichidai Kwe, Ojibwe wise woman that will say, it's our table. You don't invite us to our own table. It's our table. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. And I am encouraged that there are a lot of people out there, asking these questions, doing this self-reflection, doing the inner work, doing the work in their communities, speaking out and getting involved. I know we're all tired and there's so much work to be done. So take good care of yourselves. Be well, my relatives. Gigawabamin.